Before we start, a little bit of a warning. Folks, there's no way to tackle this without getting dark. We're going to be literally talking about leaving newborn infants in the woods to die. If that's going to disturb you, no judgment, but maybe skip this one. Also, I'm going to try and just stay in the context of ancient Greece and other societies. I know there are current events that are comparable, but I think it's best to just focus on ancient Greece for this video, all right? Let me just say thank you for your understanding, and let's get on with it. Billy Batson, Atlantia, Romulus, Remus, and Prince Paris all have something in common: being abandoned by their parents. Hello again, everyone. This is Garvin, and I review books and lately talk about subjects chosen by my patrons, including this. Child abandonment is something that comes up a lot in mythology and seems to have been at least semi common in a lot of societies ranging from Rome to even China and Japan. While there's some debate on the subject, the Greek and Roman writers of the past considered it a fairly common practice, so this is something they believed about themselves. Now, I'll be focusing on Greece because we're talking about this in the context of Greek myths, especially the Trojan War. In fact, the only major exception to this practice I could nail down was the ancient Egyptians, who were considered unusual in not only raising every kid they had, but even picking up abandoned kids they found in other countries. Now, this wasn't entirely out of kindness, as most of these kids would end up as slaves. This practice figures in the Egyptian and Greek versions of Cinderella and the likely real life inspiration of that story, but that's a different video. I'm also pretty sure that the ancient Israelites didn't abandon their kids, but I couldn't find any archaeological evidence for that either way. But let's get back to Greece. Now, keep in mind, traditions vary a lot between city states. So, what's happening in Athens is not what's happening in Sparta, and is most definitely not what's happening in Thebes, right? Um, but mostly, the decision over whether or not to keep a child is up to the child's legal father. Usually, the child is brought to its father after a period of about 5 days, by which I mean after it's been born. Until then, the child is not considered part of the family and wasn't even given a name. And there's a reason for this. Archaeological evidence, in this case a well found in Athens full of dead babies, showed that many children didn't survive that 5 day period. The main cause of death being bacterial infections that seem to be from cutting the umbilical cord with non sterile objects. Um, this is pre germ theory, no one knew. Now, after that 5 days, the child is brought to its legal father, who can decide to keep the kid or cast it out for any reason. That's right, at 5 days old, your dad could decide to kill you because he doesn't like your face. I bet you thought you had a complicated relationship with your dad, right? If the child was not going to be kept, it was taken out to the woods outside the city and left in a designated spot. Sometimes people would come and pick up abandoned babies. If these kids were super lucky, they would be adopted. Most of the ones picked up were enslaved. Otherwise, they died from exposure, starvation, or wild animals. Now, you may be asking, why take the kids out into the wilderness like this instead of just doing it yourself? The Greek and the Romans, like most societies in their day, had a taboo against kinslaying. A taboo is a social or religious rule against something, and kinslaying is a common one. While it happened, killing a family member was considered worse than killing a stranger. By leaving the kid in the woods, they can claim that they gave the gods every chance to save the kid if that's what they wanted to do, and that they, the parents, were not responsible for the child's ultimate fate. I'm sure some of you are asking, why does society permit this? And I'm not going to defend it. But keep in mind, the vast majority of the people involved, they're not happy about this, but unlike most of us, they are at the mercy of the next harvest. Not to mention plagues and war. These are people who don't have food security, and there's a hard limit to how many mouths they can feed. That doesn't make this okay, but ask yourself what kind of decisions you might make knowing if you make the wrong one, everyone in your family could starve to death or worse. Compared to our lives, theirs are pretty damn hard and grim, and I hope none of you have to go through anything close to this. Let's get into what would get a baby chosen or not. Boys were preferred over girls. Now, in ancient Greece, this was for several reasons. One, there was the practice of providing a dowry, which meant that girls would cost the family later. Second, boys were seen as potential earners who would support their parents in old age, or at least help defend them in case of war. Third, and I'm sure most of you have picked up on this already, the ancient Greeks were incredibly sexist. I mean, really sexist. To the point that the Romans and the Persians would at times tell them they needed to tone it down. When the Romans are telling you to tone down the sexism, you've gone too far. Now, I've mentioned repeatedly that some of these babies were enslaved. This was actually a pretty consistent source of slaves, alongside captured adults from wars in the ancient world, to the point that picking up abandoned babies and raising them for sale was an actual profession at times in Rome. It also became a common plot point in plays and stories that a slave would be revealed to be the abandoned or lost child of a protagonist's family. Not to mention those myths of having children abandoned only to return as heroes. I suppose the sheer amount of stories of abandoned children being adopted and raised by wild beasts and growing up to be heroic figures is a way of coping with a really raw and painful reality. Remember, most people are not happy to abandon their children, but telling yourself that the kid you couldn't afford to feed and had to leave by the road was adopted by kindly herdsmen or shepherds or even picked up and sent to slavery in Egypt was likely better than admitting to yourself what actually happened, or telling yourself that they would grow up to be strong and mighty figures after being raised by bears. Better that than the alternative. I guess it comes down to what you'd rather believe in the same situation. Well, I'm going to admit this video and the research for it was not fun, but I hope you found it informative at least. In the description, you'll find links to the sources I used. Now, this subject was chosen by my Everwise patrons. I would like to give a special shout out to Big Steve, our highest tier patron. As always, thanks, Steve. And you can join us for as little as $1 a month. Just click on the link in the description. There's also a link to my written book reviews where there's 7 years of written content to look at. I hope you enjoy that. Next up is our video on the backstory of Prince Paris, which is a lot more detailed and deeper than you could have guessed. I hope to see you there.